speaks, and I'm going to, I read out of Eckhart Tolle last week, and I'm going to read another section this morning. Do you need more knowledge? Is information going to save the world, or faster computers, more scientific or intellectual analysis? Is it not wisdom that humanity needs most at this time? But what is wisdom, and where is it to be found? Wisdom comes with the ability to be still. Just look and just listen. No more is needed. Being still, looking, and listening activates the non-conceptual intelligence within you. Let stillness direct your words and actions.
The scripture reading today comes from 1 Kings, and it's about Elijah, who has killed a number of prophets of a false god. And Jezebel is sending someone to kill Elijah, and he flees to Judah in fear. He goes there, and he has his assistant stay with him there, but then he goes alone into the desert. An angel visits him twice and brings food and beverage for his restoration. He ends up spending 40 days and nights in the desert, and then travels to Horeb. And so the reading begins, 1 Kings 19, verse 9 through 13a. Then he went into a cave and spent the night, and the word of Yahweh came to him. What are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah replied, I have been very zealous for Yahweh God. The people of Israel have abandoned your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death by the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. God said, go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of Yahweh, for Yahweh is about to pass by. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountain apart and shattered the rocks by Yahweh's power. But Yahweh was not in the whirlwind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave.
Would you pray? Gentle whisper. Help us to slow down enough to listen, to hear deep within ourselves, to regain our perspective on life, and to hear the wisdom that resides within, in the clear, still, small voice of you, divine essence, wisdom, light, ground of our being. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of each of our hearts be filled with your wisdom and your insight. Amen. So Elijah was one of the great Old Testament prophets, full of power and full of wisdom, but he got himself in a little bit of trouble. Somehow, he single-handedly managed to slaughter 450 prophets of the Canaanite god Baal. Well, these happened to be Queen Jezebel's prophets. She followed the traditions and the rituals of the Canaanite gods. And when she found out, she was rather irritated and vowed revenge. And when he found out, He hightailed it out of town. And as Robin said, he fled for 40 days and 40 nights. And we pick him up in this passage where he's hiding out in a cave on Mount Horeb, which was known to be one of, the holier places where one would find God. So he's hiding out in a cave, and Yahweh comes to him and says, Elijah, what are you doing here? So clearly now we know it was not God's idea for Elijah to be hiding out in a cave. And Elijah says, well, you don't understand. I have been your most zealous prophet. I have been devoted. I have done everything you wanted me to do. I even got rid of 450 of those false prophets. But I'm in trouble now. Jezebel's after me. He's trying to kill me, and I'm running for my life. And if Yahweh could roll eyes, that's what I picture right about now. Okay, tell you what, Elijah, why don't you take a deep breath and just wait here until I pass by. And Elijah said, okay, I'm just gonna wait. Because Yahweh essentially calls him into stillness. Into shutting down those fears, into going past them, into going deeper than them, and listening. To listen for Yahweh to pass by. And then there's this great, huge windstorm. And it's roaring outside, and it's shattering rocks. The closest I can think of is, like a tornado went by. But somehow, Elijah knows that God isn't in this crazy windstorm. And then there's an earthquake. Has anybody ever been in an earthquake? I've never been in an earthquake. I don't know. So like rumbling and ground shaking and things moving and falling. Maybe he was worried about the cave falling in on him. I don't know. But somehow he went, well, that's a lot of power, but I'm still not hearing God's voice. And then a fire rages through, and he says, well, God's not in that either. Still not hearing God's voice, but he's paying attention, which is really pretty impressive for this whole time. He's still sitting still and listening. And then he hears, this interpretation says, the gentle whisper. Maybe you're used to hearing the still small voice of God. And he hears that in the silence. And he walks out of the cave, and Yahweh proceeds to tell him what to do next. The whole story to me is a wonderful metaphor for our own lives and for the call to sitting still and stopping and listening. So let's flesh out the metaphor, if you will, with me. If you think about our lives, what's the tornado? What's the windstorm? What's shattering the rocks? What was that?
Our daily life.
Our daily lives. Okay? The busyness, the what?
The noise.
The noise of our daily lives.
Must do this, must do that, must.
The going. So we use the metaphors. We're caught up in the whirlwind, right? Of all of the stuff going on, the noise that beats at us, the doing and the going. Okay, so what about the earthquake as a metaphor for life? What does that say? COVID. Because why?
Because everything stopped and everything is so dangerous.
Because of it stopped everything and it's dangerous. What else? Unpredictable. People's lives are shattered. Clarice is doing this in the back.
You don't know where your floor is anymore. It's shifted.
Right, so the very foundations of your life are moving and shaking and shifting. Anything else? Beth?
It's just so hard with the COVID to feel like there's nothing you can do.
It's hard to feel like there's nothing you can do. So it's a lack of control.
And everything is a risk.
And everything is what?
A risk.
A risk. Okay. So what about the fire that comes by? How many times have we said, I've spent all day putting out fires? Right? One thing after another that you've got to take care of that's gone wrong. So that's what, for me, that's That's the metaphor. And in the midst of it all, Elijah is just kind of being a still presence and waiting to hear beneath it and into the silence, waiting for that still small voice to bubble up and help him discern what to do next. Marcus Borg talks about the Hebrew for what's translated as gentle whisper, still small voice, and it's actually bat kol. Bat means daughter and kol means sound. So it's the daughter of a sound. Can also be translated as, and I'm going to forget it specifically, the sound of thinnest silence. The sound of thinnest silence. So that's what we're talking about, the gentle whisper, the still small voice, the sound of thinnest silence, the daughter of a sound. It's reaching for an understanding that this sound is beyond words. It's past the boundaries of speech. It's the presence of the ineffable God. Have you ever heard that sound? Marcus Borg said when he's asked people that, he had one woman who said that when she was 7 years old, she heard clear as day, as clear as any other voice she'd ever heard. You heard a voice say to her, "You belong to me." She said, but I didn't hear it with my ears, but I heard it. And he said another woman talked about a time she got home in the evening and she felt this intense presence of Jesus being there with her. And she said, "Where have you been?" And he said, "I've never left you." But she too said she heard it now with her ears, and yet she still heard the voice. That people don't talk about this because it sounds like you're weird. And I don't even talk about this much, but I first heard that voice when I was probably 18 or 19. And I was in college and I was getting a marketing degree, and I knew, next to nothing about religion, spirituality. And I heard a voice that said, well, maybe you could be a pastor. And I ignored it because clearly it was messing with my plans to be a high-powered marketing executive. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that the voice came back again. And it was the same thing. It wasn't an auditory voice, but it was a voice nonetheless. And then I ignored it again. And finally when it came back when I was about 25 and I was at a place in my career that was kind of unrewarding and sketchy, I decided I'll look into that. And here I am like 30 years later. All of that to say that if you've heard that voice that you're not hearing with ears, but you're hearing nonetheless, you're not necessarily going crazy. Now there are voices that want to lead you down like a not so great path. That's probably not God or your deepest wisdom. It tends to be a voice that calls you to something that is beyond you, that wouldn't have come from you. But even outside of that, it's not necessarily a voice, it's a deep feeling, it's a gut feeling, it's a knowing, it's an intuition, it's a wisdom that bubbles up from within, it's an aha moment, an epiphany, when you least expect it, that leads you in the right direction, that helps you come to new understanding. It's any and all of those things. Siddhartha Gautama Buddha was the quintessential example of someone who sat in stillness and came to a deeper wisdom. Heard that voice of wisdom. He had spent years seeking enlightenment through all kinds of austerities. And he came to the end of 5-6 years, and he was emaciated, and he was sick, and he was near death. And imagine that, he went, boy, there's got to be a better way. I could have had a V8. And he sat himself down underneath the Bodhi tree and he meditated and he sat in stillness for a couple of days until all of a sudden he was able to get underneath all of it to his deepest self, to that deep universal consciousness, to the wisdom within where he could know the reality of himself. And it's said that a universal light flooded into him. And he was one with all things, and he knew the radiance and the compassion and the presence of our true nature, all of our true natures. That's what stillness can bring to us. Someone once asked pianist Arthur Rubinstein, said, how do you handle the notes as well as you do? And immediately and passionately he said, I don't handle the notes any better than anyone else. It's the pauses. The pauses are where the art resides. It's in the moment between our breaths. It's the moments in between when we're speaking or in between our thoughts. It's the smallest moment or the biggest breath, the longest opportunity we can to just be with the moment and be present. Professor Tara Brach talks about a woman who was spending an evening with her mother. And her mother told her that evening that she had breast cancer. And the daughter immediately went into shock, but a need to do something shock. It was sort of a, oh my gosh, what's going on here? Okay, what do we do next? Is this operable? Who do we need to talk to? All of those sorts of things. And it was her way of coping in the moment, at the stress. And she started making dinner that evening, and she's going and she's worrying about dinner, and she's reading doctor's reports, and she's keeping herself busy so as not to engage the feelings, not to break down what she's afraid she's going to. But she's had a little bit of training in mindfulness and in meditation, and even in the midst of this whirlwind, this chaos, this earthquake, ground-shattering news, she's able to take a little step back inside of herself, and in one of those little tiny pauses, she says, are you noticing what's going on? And in that moment, what she notices is that her mom is not engaging this conversation at all. She is not engaging this hurried needing to know. Her mother is simply sitting there at the kitchen table, staring into a cup of coffee. And that moment of stillness allows her a new perspective, allows her to sit back and see that her mother's scared, and that needs to be honored in this moment. And while she risks melting down by going over and giving her a hug, she determines that that's exactly what she needs to do. And she walks over and she puts her arms around her mom and just holds her. And then she starts rocking back and forth, like a mother rocks a child, except this time it was a child rocking her mother. And she said she'll never forget that moment, as beautiful as it was, as short as it was, because she almost missed it. She almost didn't stop enough, and she would have missed it. Pausing, slowing down, being still for a moment allows us to see that which we might not otherwise see, so that our actions and our words might bubble up from somewhere deep within, a place of wisdom, instead of a reaction. and a fear and an anxiety or an anger or a frustration. Is this all making sense? One more example. How many of you have seen Schindler's List? A lot of you. So for those of you who haven't seen it, it's the story about a German by the name of Oskar Schindler who moves into the Krakow area so that he can open a factory and really take advantage of the cheap Jewish labor that's in the Krakow ghettos. And he's rationalizing all of this, and he's in tight with the Nazis, and he bribes them for what he wants, and yada yada. And then there's an order given to liquidate the ghetto. And in one scene you have Schindler standing up on a hill overlooking this ghetto and the chaos and the carnage and the violence and the killing that's going on as they quote-unquote liquidate the ghetto. And in the midst of this awful scene, there's a little 3-year-old girl in a red coat, the only color in a black and white movie, and she winds her way through the killing and through the violence. She walks down the street and around the corner, and he follows her from this vantage point. His eyes follow her walking through all of this horrendous stuff until she enters a building and hides in the violence herself. But it's in that moment, it's in that stillness of that moment that he can't rationalize what he's doing anymore. It's in that moment that he comes back to his own humanity. And from there on, he spends his fortune, and it's based on a true story, spends his fortune bribing Nazi officials to save as many Jews by keeping them employed in his factory as possible. Ends up saving over 1,000 lives. But he could have just kept going on doing what he was doing if he had had that moment of stopping and stillness and coming back to a deeper self, a truer self, a wiser self. The still small God, voice of God resides in that stillness. If we will stop and listen, it will bring us a new perspective, bring us back to our compassionate, radiant, beautiful, wise selves. Amen.